If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as follow me and subscribe to me on all my other social media platforms. What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with another discography ranking for you guys. It's been a little bit since the Iron Maiden ranking, and here we are at the beginning of August, and I am here to do yet another ranking for you metalheads watching. So, kind of have been building up to this one for a while. I've talked about Slayer, Megadeth, Metallica. There's only one band left in the American Big Four of thrash metal to talk about, and that is, of course, New York's own Anthrax. So yeah, this is one that's been long awaited, needed to happen to finally complete the Big Four of American thrash, get it out of the way. Now, as far as my history on how I got into Anthrax, it kind of goes into how I got into thrash in the beginning. Like, already as a kid, I was already big into Metallica, but it wasn't until about the time I was in junior high when I was like watching documentaries on like VH1 Classic and like countdown videos of like 40 greatest metal songs or 100 greatest hard rock songs on VH1 and VH1 Classic, back when they would actually play music, or at least music-oriented shows. What a novel concept, but I digress. And I would discover Anthrax through those countdown shows. So pretty much ever since then, I was slowly, gradually getting more into Anthrax, and then I got into their 80s work, and then over time, although I will be honest, Anthrax has been like the one band in the Big Four that's kind of been forgotten about for me, just because like I've been discovering so many bands, so many other subgenres of metal, that Anthrax has been one of those bands that's kind of almost like time skipped around them for me. But it was fun to kind of go back and re-listen to some of the classics, and I had a good time with it. So, pretty big fan of the band, even though I can acknowledge they are definitely the weakest of the Big Four thrash bands, at least in my personal opinion, but they're still great. It's just, yeah, they're definitely the one band in the Big Four that sticks out like a sore thumb because of some stuff we'll talk about as we talk about the history and the albums. But without further ado, speaking of the history and the albums, why don't we get started? So Anthrax formed in July of 1981 out of Yonkers, New York, and it was formed by two very close friends, Scott Ian Rosenfeld and Dan Lilker. Both went to high school together, and while Scott was a year older than Dan, they both, I think, were in the same class together, I believe, and both loved punk and hip-hop and heavy metal, and they wanted to kind of continue their bond of all things heavy metal, so they wanted to form their own band. And they came up with the name Anthrax after reading about the actual disease in a biology textbook in school, and Scott thought, well, it sounds like a metal band name, why don't we go with that? So Anthrax was born in 1981 after Scott and Dan graduated high school. Now, early on, Anthrax kind of wasn't doing a whole lot because, well, Scott was going to college, but eventually dropped out because he wanted to get the band going, much to the chagrin of his mother. And even his mother had him sent to a psychiatrist. And, yeah, basically, Scott's mom was a Karen. Essentially, a Karen before Karens were a thing. But, yeah, it was what it was. But yeah, Scott and Dan formed a band, and original members, Scott would eventually actually change his name from Scott Ian Rosenfeld to just Scott Ian. So he and Dan would be the two guitarists. For bass, they would get a friend of theirs named Kenny Kushner, drums, Dave Weiss, and for vocals, Scott's younger brother, Jason Rosenfeld. And this was before, I think, Jason hit puberty, because he was able to hit some pretty high notes for them. But because Jason was the younger brother and their mother wasn't too enthused with Scott being in the band, let alone the younger son, Jason, being in the band, so they decided probably best to keep our mom at check, keep her at bay, so Jason would leave in 1982. Also, Kenny and Dave would leave in 82, and then in 1982, more lineup shifts occur. Dan would actually switch over to bass, and in comes guitarist Greg Walls, drummer, an interesting one, Greg D'Angelo, who would later go on to play for White Lion, Pride and Glory, and Black Label Society. So, pretty interesting pedigree for this guy going forward after his short-lived time in Anthrax. And then for vocals, they would get Neil Turbin, who was also a classmate of Scott and Dan's back in their high school days. So this would be the lineup going forward for the rest of 1982, heading into 1983. Although, after doing early demo in 82, both the Gregs, Walls and D'Angelo, would leave. Greg D'Angelo to go pursue White Lion, and Greg Walls basically went nowhere. So now in comes new players that are going to be important for most of the Anthrax history, at least for one of them, and then for the rest of the history with another. In comes guitarist Dan Spitz, who is actually the younger brother of Dave Spitz, who Dave was mostly known for playing bass for Black Sabbath in the mid-80s. Well, Black Sabbath in name only. Eternal Idol sucks. Or not Eternal Idol, wow. I mean, Seventh Star, wow. I'm going to leave that in. I don't care. I think that was funny. I'll take. But anyway, so yeah, Dan would come in on guitars. For drums, they would pick up Charlie Benante, and he would remain in the band going forward. So this is the lineup. Scott, the Dans of Lilker and Spitz, Neil, and Charlie. Now, around this time this lineup was put together in 1983, meanwhile here in the States, while mainstream-wise, glam metal was becoming the flavor of the month, but in the underground, thrash metal had really started to take off thanks to the success of Metallica over across the country in San Francisco/LA. And during that time when Metallica made their No Life Till Leather demo, circulated all over the place and made it all the way to a local record shop in New Jersey called Rock and Roll Heaven, run by both Johnny and Marcia Zazula. And they heard this demo and was blown away by how unbelievably heavy and fast it was. And this was a shop that the boys in Anthrax would go to from time to time to buy records or cassettes. And Johnny played Scott the No Life Till Leather demo, and Scott was absolutely, like, mind blown. And it led Scott to want Anthrax to help build that scene over in the East Coast, whereas thrash was largely a West Coast phenomenon. There were some thrash or hardcore bands coming up in the East Coast, but not to the extent of what was going on in LA and San Francisco and so on and so forth. So Scott had the mission of getting Anthrax to be one of the big bands on the East Coast for thrash and really get that scene going. Now, it was around this time Johnny and Marcia decided to form their own record label called Megaforce Records, on the sole purpose to sign Metallica, because nobody else wanted Metallica at that point, because thrash was just one of those genres that major labels were just too afraid to touch at the time. Because after all, it was something new, something fresh, something unique, something a little more intense, a little heavier, a little more extreme. So Johnny and Marcia made Megaforce on the sole purpose to sign Metallica and help bring Metallica over to record their debut album, Kill 'Em All. And at the same time, yeah, the lineup shifts with Metallica happened. But when Metallica settled in New York for the recordings, the guys in Anthrax gave them an old apartment to live in for the time being, with like a little fridge and a toaster oven. Because, say what you will about Metallica, they paid their fucking dues early on. You can't take that away from them. But Scott would be watching his buddies in Metallica record, so he was very determined to get Anthrax signed to Megaforce Records. So they released a demo in 83, sent it to Johnny, and Johnny thought it wasn't that good. But Scott was like, okay, we'll see you next week. We'll try to do better next time. Scott would end up going to IHOP, where Johnny and Marcia ate breakfast, and dropped their second demo, which Johnny thought was really good, but still wasn't enough to sign Anthrax to Megaforce Records. And then finally, Scott was more determined than ever, especially after Kill 'Em All came out, and like Scott was super determined, more than ever, to get Anthrax signed to Megaforce Records. So he would take, I think it was about $2,000 he had saved from his bar mitzvah, and went to a studio to record the song Soldiers of Metal, which, that's a hell of a song for Anthrax right there. And he would send the song over to Johnny, and Johnny was like, holy crap, this is actually incredible. All right, Anthrax, you're on the label. So October of '83, Anthrax officially signed to Megaforce Records, the second band to sign on the label behind Metallica. And then pretty much immediately after signing to Megaforce, Anthrax would go into the studio to record their debut album, and then finally released in January of 1984 on Megaforce Records, we get the debut album, Fistful of Metal. This is my number 6 album. I still think this is a fun debut. Yeah, it may not hold a candle to some of the albums we're about to talk about very shortly, but still, for a debut, it was a pretty solid debut album for the simple fact that these guys were as young as they were hungry, filled with like punk energy, but wanted to create something that was fun yet still vicious. Songs like Death Rider, the opening track, just really sets a good pace for the album. Metal Thrashing Mad was a killer track. Even a really solid cover of Alice Cooper's I'm 18. Panic, Soldiers of Metal ended up on the album. Death from Above, the song Anthrax, like pretty much top to bottom, no bad song on here. Of course, I would say the one big dividing line for a lot of fans is Neil Turbin's vocals. Very high register. He was kind of more of like a mixture of like a Nuwabum vocalist and from like, say, I don't know, Kansas or something. I don't know. But like Neil Turbin's vocals were definitely a lot higher register than most thrash vocalists at this point in its infancy. So yeah, definitely added something different to Anthrax. In comparison to the other bands in the Big Four, definitely with Anthrax early on you had much more melodic singing involved. But top to bottom, still a fun debut, no complaints. My number 6. Now, not long after Fistful of Metal came out, they would do some shows, mostly locally in the New York area, but then around the end of '84, the band would undergo kind of a tumultuous time. Basically, Dan Lilker and Neil Turbin did not get along anymore by this point, and it led to a bit of a war zone between the two, and Neil decided to drop an ultimatum on the rest of the guys. Either Lilker's gone, or I'm gone. And Scott didn't want to risk having the band fall apart, so unfortunately he, Charlie, and Spitz ended up saying goodbye to Dan Lilker. But luckily, Lilker wasn't upset at the guys. He understood the band had to go on the way it had to. And in Dan Lilker's place would be Frankie Bello, who is actually the nephew of Charlie Benante. He would come in and take over on bass going forward, and a suitable replacement. Dan Lilker's a hell of a bassist in his own right. However, I would say Frankie, little bit of an upgrade, especially considering Frankie plays with his fingers. He was kind of like the New York equivalent of like Cliff Burton because of his style of finger picking on the bass, super fast and aggressive. So for a little while you had this lineup of Frankie, Charlie, Scott, Spitz, and Neil Turbin, and they would continue to do shows. But then going into 1985, the band would undergo probably the biggest lineup change in their history. Basically, Scott, Charlie, Frankie, and Danny, they were not happy with Neil Turbin anymore, and it pretty much stemmed from Neil's ultimatum he gave to the rest of the guys to get rid of Dan Lilker. So basically, Scott and the rest of the guys just said, fuck you to Neil, and kicked him out of the band. And still some issues between Neil and the rest of the Anthrax guys, even still to this day. As, after all, Scott's even admitted in interviews that getting rid of Dan Lilker was the biggest regret he ever made, or the biggest regret he ever had, I should say, with Anthrax. But alas, Frankie comes in, and now Neil Turbin's gone, and in Neil Turbin's place would come Joey Belladonna. And I would say vocals, massive upgrade, and you'll understand why. So during this time of Joey coming in, they would do an EP, and then would actually go to the studio to work on their second album, and then released in October of 1985, we get Spreading the Disease. This is my number 2 album. Again, kind of similar to what I was talking about with Iron Maiden on that ranking, where you go from the debut to Killers, massive leap in terms of songwriting and production. You get the same thing here. Going from Fistful to Spreading feels like night and day difference. Like the production, it got heavier, the tones got heavier, it got a little bit faster in spots. Then again, they would also get a little more groovy in spots, but also the vocals. Joey Belladonna still, in my opinion, is the true voice of Anthrax. After all, he's basically like the Steve Perry of thrash. Like, he sounds like what would happen if Steve Perry sang over Metallica. It's incredible what he can do with his voice. And right out of the gate, you open with AIR, which is one of my favorite Anthrax songs of all time. It is thrashy, it is heavy, filled with ripping guitar leads. And Joey's vocals, when they come in, it's like, wait, they can do that? They can have that kind of vocal style on top of this kind of aggressive music? Holy hell. But yeah, they made it work, and it sounded great. And pretty much this is a classic sophomore album in thrash. Like, every song's incredible. Lone Justice, the big single Madhouse, with one of the best music videos you'll ever see, where they're playing at an insane asylum. It's awesome. The Enemy has been one of my personal favorites off of the album. You also get the song Armed and Dangerous, which has this wonderful acoustic melody, and then it gets into like speed metal fury. And then Gung Ho ended on a thrash note, even though it ends in kind of a silly way. But that's kind of a sneak attack with Anthrax. They're able to bring in a little bit of humor into their songs, or even in some of the lyrics, which I think is one of the big reasons why they stick out like a sore thumb in the big four of American thrash. But still, top to bottom, it's a classic for a reason, and it's my number 2. Now, not long after Spreading the Disease came out, they would actually begin to tour, and one show they did was over at the Roseland Ballroom in, I think it was in New York City, where they played with Metallica and new wave of British heavy metal legends Raven, and this was sometime in like early 86, and like end of 85 heading into 86, and there were a lot of major label executives at this show, and basically all 3 bands delivered and then some with their shows. And Metallica ended up getting their deal on Elektra Records. Raven got their deal with Atlantic Records. Anthrax was still on Megaforce. They didn't get signed that night, but they did get scouted. It just took them a couple of more months to get signed. But you could pretty much say all 3 of the bands earned their major label deals from playing that Roseland show. And the label that Anthrax would go on is Island Records. So they would actually be on both Island and Megaforce for a little while to release stuff on both labels, but getting much more financial backing from Island, which was great. Now, they're recording their next album throughout much of 86, and then they get to do a European tour opening for Metallica. Cool thing to get to open for some of their closest friends. When sadly, tragedy struck, September 27th, 1986, we lost Cliff Burton in the bus accident on the road in Sweden during this tour, and the tour quickly got canceled. And I've talked long enough about Cliff Burton's legacy on the Metallica ranking, so I'll just spare you the details. Essentially, his death affected everyone, and it was sad, and it was a dark time in metal. But after the death of one of their closest friends, Anthrax decided to go back and finish up this album with more intensity and more anger, but also more, like, let's celebrate Cliff's life almost, and let's celebrate thrash as a whole. And released in 1987, March of 1987, we get Among the Living. This is my number 1. I knew it would be heading into this ranking because, after all, this is still a classic. Still a classic album to this day, one of the best thrash albums of all time. Starting off right away with the title track with that cool, like, epic intro where it builds up nicely and then it gets fast and furious. Lots of great double kick. And then you get other big tracks like Caught in a Mosh, probably one of the big mosh pit anthem songs with one of the best bass lines in metal history. I Am the Law, great track based on Judge Dredd. After all, this album really has a lot of Stephen King influence in the lyrical content. The song Indians, which is still, I think, the band's most popular song still to this day. After all, it's also one of the best thrash songs of all time with some great vocal hooks, great like riffs that are catchy, awesome drum work. But then you actually do get some deep cuts on here, like A Skeleton in the Closet, Evil New Confession, One World, Horror of It All, which was a little bit more of a darker track. But Imitation of Life, arguably up to this point, the most brutal sounding Anthrax song, like, because it's so fast. It's almost like, I would say, German thrash levels of speed, because, like, holy crap, Charlie is going to town on the drum kit on this song. Like, yeah, it starts off slower, but then when it gets into those really fast parts, it's like, holy crap, Charlie, you are losing it on the kit. It's insanity. But yeah, top to bottom, it's still a classic, and it's a classic for a reason. It is my number one. So, moving out from Among the Living, they're doing some shows. However, around the same time, they decided to do something very unique and take a risk. Because all the guys in the band are also not just big metal fans, but big hip-hop fans, they decided, what would happen if we were to mix hip-hop and metal together? Wonder what would happen. Let's just do it for fun and just goof off. And then sometime after Among the Living, they would release the single, I'm the Man, which is one of the funniest songs out there. It's one of the first rap metal tunes you'll hear, and while looking back on it, yeah, by today's standards, it's pretty corny and cheesy, but who cares? It's fun. Let them have fun. It was a fun, goofy song where I think it's just Scott, Charlie, and Frankie doing the raps, and even Joey's doing the drums on the song, which he's actually a pretty solid drummer. And yeah, they just had a ball with that song. So that actually got the band a lot of acclaim at the time and helped them sell more copies of Among the Living, because I believe the single came out a little after Among the Living, and it got the band some notoriety and a lot of acclaim. So it was a big risk, big reward. So there you have it. Now, they would return to the studio in early 1988, and released in September of 1988, we would get State of Euphoria. This one is my number 8 album, and this is a case where it was a rushed album. Now, overall, it's still good. It's still a good album, but you can definitely tell in certain spots, yeah, they definitely did rush this album out in terms of the songs and the production, because some of these songs kind of had some unfinished ideas. But the reason why they rushed this album out is because they were slated to open for Iron Maiden on their Seventh Son of a Seventh Son tour, and Anthrax did not want to pass that up. So they decided, okay, let's just try and get this album done as quickly as possible so we can get ready to go on the road with Maiden. And it does kind of show that they rushed it. But still, even for a rushed album, it's decent. Like, I would say the big tracks that still get noted to this day would be their cover of Trust's Antisocial, which is one of the best covers of all time, and the opening track, Be All End All. Like, that song feels like it could have been on Among the Living, I'll be honest. Like, there were ideas where they were trying to get a little bit faster, a little more aggressive, but I feel like if they had been given more time to really construct these songs better and get the production just right, I think the album would have been a lot better. But for what it was, it's still a decent album, and it does have some gems in there, but overall, my number 8. Now, after State of Euphoria, they would go on the tour with Maiden, and then a couple of tumultuous things started to happen with Anthrax. Basically, the majority of the band rarely, if at all, drink. Joey Belladonna was the one exception. He was the big partier of the band, drinking all the time, and they soon realized it was starting to affect his performance. And it led to Scott sitting Joey down to tell him that, yeah, your drinking's getting out of hand and you're not sounding the best live, buddy. Joey didn't want to believe that, and then finally Scott just relented and say he either gets clean, or we get a new singer, or I'm quitting the band. Eventually, Joey agreed to cut down on his partying and would eventually quit drinking altogether in 1989. Then, around the same time in 1989, some infighting between Charlie and Frankie, but that's kind of like sibling rivalry stuff that's happened in their childhoods and really happens ever since, because it's uncle and nephew, only 2 years apart. So, yeah, it led to some infighting a little bit between the two, but it was largely like sibling rivalry, typical stuff. But then also, probably one of the worst times, one of the worst moments in the band's history. Their rehearsal studio in Queens burned to the ground after an electrical fire, where they had their amps, their guitars, their basses, their drums, all their gear that they've recorded or played with, all burned in this fire. And then what makes it worse, people sneak out, go to that building, and find stuff that wasn't completely destroyed and go and get it refurbished and sell it. Like, that's shitty. And, you know, a lot of their good equipment was gone, but they would eventually get new stuff and would enter the studio in late 1989. And this album, they got pretty dark for the most part in terms of the lyrical themes and even in the music. Released in August of 1990, we would get Persistence of Time. This is my number 3 album. I would say in terms of the thrash albums, hands down, this is the darkest Anthrax album up to this point. And also, like, what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. And you could argue this is maybe the most progressive Anthrax album because the songs start getting longer. They start toying around with new ideas to, like, expand sections or just do sections really quickly, kind of like a prog metal or prog rock band. And I'd say it worked for the most part because, especially with how dark this album is, definitely going down that prog route definitely benefited it. Like, opening up with the song Time felt like a dark, eerie track. Blood, kind of in the same thing. You got Keep It in the Family, In My World, Belly of the Beast, which was one of the big singles, but really the song is, or really the album's most remembered for their cover of Joe Jackson's Got the Time, which Anthrax always do a great job with cover songs. No matter what it is, they do a good job. But you also get, like, One Man Stands, Hate Red or Hatred. That's pure anger right there. And then a song called Discharge at the very end. Like, top to bottom, it's heavy, it's filled with anger and hatred, and just after what they experienced with that fire, losing their stuff, can you blame them for wanting to go down this darker route? And even it's considered their most painful album they've ever made in terms of everything that went down. But it's still one of the best albums of their entire career, and it is my number 3. Now, before they wrapped up the recordings of Persistence of Time, Scott decided he had an idea. Told Charlie, hey, don't break down your kit yet. I have an idea. All of the guys were huge fans of the hip-hop legends Public Enemy, and they were big fans of the song Bring the Noise, and they decided, what if we got the permission from Public Enemy to take that song, just take the vocals and some of the beats, and we just record riffs and drum beats and bass lines and created our own version of Bring the Noise. And lo and behold, the idea came to pass, and it was released in 1991 as part of the Attack of the Killer Bees compilation, and wow, the song blew up. It blew up so big that eventually Public Enemy and Anthrax decided to do a national tour together where they would end the night jamming Bring the Noise. And it's still, in my opinion, the greatest rap metal song ever made. It's still, and it doesn't sacrifice on either end of the spectrum. You still have nice, catchy beats, but it's still heavy and thrashy. And even Scott, he can spit some lines in his own right, like, because he's doing the last rap at the end of the song. And he's pretty solid. So yeah, this song pretty much made Anthrax into mainstream darlings forever, almost. And eventually, on the success of Bring the Noise, they would get signed to a bigger major label, and that's Elektra Records. And then we get into what I still think is a bit of a confusing time for Anthrax. 1992, after they got the Elektra deal and after the huge success of Bring the Noise, Joey Belladonna was let go from the band. And still to this day, I don't understand why they got rid of him at the time, because Joey had been clean and sober for well over 2 years by this point, and even Joey to this day still found that dismissal to be hard to understand. And even Charlie has said in interviews, yeah, it's like people were saying, yeah, I don't think you should do it. But they felt if they didn't get rid of Joey, they wouldn't have been a band anymore. I'm still confused as to, like, what their thought process was. But their replacement would be a good one. They would get Armored Saint frontman John Bush to come into Anthrax. And so that would be the lineup now with John, Scott, Charlie, Frankie, and Danny. And then they would go into the studio in 1992, and released in May of 1993, we get the Elektra Records debut, Sound of White Noise. Now, this definitely begins a very divisive period for Anthrax. Like, the John Bush era is very divisive. However, I will say, this is my number 7 album. I would say, in terms of the John Bush era, easily the best work of the entire era. Yeah, it might be a little bit bloated with a lot of songs that kind of don't go many places, but there are still some pretty damn good tracks on here. Room for One More, High Pro Glow, Black Lodge, but the big hit Only, I still think is one of the top 10 best Anthrax songs of all time. And yeah, definitely around this point, they wanted to go down the more groove metal route, as well as like alternative metal, because they were really into Pantera, as well as, you know, Helmet and Faith No More at this point, so they kind of wanted to blend all that together. Not really any thrash on here to speak of, apart from the guitar solos. Like, I feel like this album, Dan spits his leads. I feel like he forgets he's not playing a thrash album. He's playing a groove metal, alternative metal album, but he's still playing these ripping leads, which definitely kind of clash a little bit with the songs. But as far as the songwriting, it's still solid. It's still a pretty good album, although I do think it's arguably the most overrated Anthrax album out there. But still good, but easily the best of the John Bush era, no question. And it is my number 7. Now, after Sound of White Noise, they would tour for about a year and a half up to this time frame, and in early 1995, Danny Spitz would end up leaving the band, and basically left the band as a 4-piece, at least studio-wise, but for live guitars as well as some studio work, they would get Paul Crook to join in on guitars, and he's most known for being a guitarist for Meatloaf, who, ironically enough, was Scott Ian's stepfather, because Scott married Meatloaf's adopted daughter, Pearl. So there you go. Little family ties there, thanks to Paul Crook. But Paul, yeah, he would come in, play live leads, and also do some leads on some albums. Now, they would eventually go back to the studio in early 1995, and then released in October of 1995, we would get Stomp 442. This is my number 10. I feel like this album, they were trying to mash together what they were doing on Sound of White Noise and kind of try and bring in a little hint of the thrash. Like, the song Fueled has some thrashy parts, but aside from that, this album just feels thin and directionless. Like, I feel like the band themselves were confused on what direction this album should go. Like, the songs feel really mismatched, if anything else. And on top of that, like, yeah, the production, not the best. Although, they would get a guest star, a pretty big guest star, on the songs King Size and Riding Shotgun. They would get Dimebag Darrell from Pantera, who would pretty much kind of remain a guest star for Anthrax for the next couple of albums. So he was kind of like a secret 6th member of Anthrax, because they'd become very close friends, almost like brothers. So this would be the first inkling of Dimebag in the Anthrax history. But still, even though ripping leads, just this album just does nothing for me. It really doesn't do anything for me at all, and that's why it fell to number 10. Now, because of the lackluster nature of Stomp 442, Anthrax would end up being dismissed from Elektra Records, leading them to join independent label Ignition Records. However, before they would get to do anything, another tragedy strikes Anthrax. Sometime in the fall of 1996, Frankie's younger brother, Anthony Bello, and Charlie's nephew as well, basically what happened was Anthony was shot and murdered in a shooting in New York and was killed. And it really broke the band's heart, because Anthony was one of the band's biggest fans. and he was taken from them due to a murder, and also the murder would never be solved, which tormented Frankie and Charlie to no end. So, and they even described this time frame in 96 heading into 97 as the worst time in the band's history. Could you blame them for thinking that? After all, they lost a family member who was a big fan of the band. But moving away from the tragedy, they would get back to the studio in late 1997, and then released in July of 1998 on Ignition Records, we would get Volume 8, The Threat Is Real. This is my last place album. This is my number 11. It's just bloated. I mean, there's 15 tracks on here, and a lot of the material just does nothing for me. Like this, again, similar to Stomp 442, it's just very directionless and mismatched again. And it's like, you can definitely tell they were in a dark place at this point when they wrote this album. And really the only track from this time frame of 95 through the end of the 90s that was any count due to the subject matter, the song Pieces, which actually was part of a hidden track with the final song Stealing from a Thief. There was like this little 2 minutes of silence and then into Pieces. The song Pieces, basically written by Frankie, an expression of grief after losing Anthony. And the song itself, it's a beautiful song. Absolutely. But it just doesn't quite fit on this album, but I will say that was the one song from this mid to late 90s time period that was any count. It's a good song, it's a beautiful song, but it's not enough to save this album for me at all. I'd say easily the worst Anthrax album in their history, and yeah, not my cup of tea at all. Number 11. Not long after Volume 8, The Threat Is Real came out, Ignition Records ended up losing all their funding and had to declare for bankruptcy, leaving Anthrax without a home once again. And then also, stuff doesn't help that eventually they would regroup in like 2001, and they would get picked up by actually a couple of different labels. They would get kind of like a three-way deal with Century Media, Nuclear Blast, and Sanctuary Records for like different parts of the world to release music. And they were actually getting ready to do a big tour with Judas Priest, opening for Judas Priest. However, 9/11 happened, and then eventually not long after 9/11, the anthrax attacks of the actual bacteria killing 5 innocent people in the aftermath, and it was all over the news, the anthrax scare in New York during that time frame, and it led the band to being under a ton of scrutiny. And even Scott said it was the first time he felt the band wasn't really theirs anymore. However, sometime in late October, when Scott went to Ground Zero to survey the devastation, this firefighter came running across the street to talk to Scott, because Scott was thinking about changing the band's name because of everything that happened. But this firefighter came across the street and talked to Scott and said, "Hey, you guys are the best. Don't change your name. Don't let them win. Don't let them win." And it lit a fire under Scott, and then he would tell the rest of the guys, and it lit a fire under them. And also, I forgot to mention, around the same time, they would finally get a permanent second guitarist, and that would be Rob Caggiano, sometime in mid-2001, so he comes into the fold. And then eventually all this stuff happens. The firefighter lights the fire under Anthrax to keep the name going. And then sometime, I want to say in November 2001, there was this huge show, the New York Steel Benefit Show, where it was Anthrax, Ace Frehley, Overkill, Sebastian Bach, and headlined by Twisted Sister, who had reunited for the first time since the 80s. They would all play this New York Steel benefit show for the policemen and for the police and the firefighters of New York City. And when Anthrax came out, they were all wearing the white jumpsuits saying, "We're not changing our name," to a huge ovation, and then played a destructive show. And basically, they were like, "Fuck the terrorists. We're keeping Anthrax because we're not going to let them tell us what to do." And it got press back for Anthrax in a good way. And then they had this deal worked out again with Century Media, Nuclear Blast, and Sanctuary to release stuff all across the world. Then they would finally get back to the studio in 2002, and then released in February of 2003, we get We've Come For You All. This one is my number 9 album. We're now finally starting to move up a little bit. Yeah, it's still near the bottom, but the album as a whole, again, it's still bloated with too many songs. There's 14 songs on here, and not a lot of them are very wide-ranging, but there are some noteworthy tracks on here, and actually some really cool guest stars, like Roger Daltrey from The Who comes in to do vocals on the song Taking the Music Back, which is actually a really good track. And then the songs Strap It On and Cadillac Rockbox, once again bringing Dimebag Darrell in to do guitar leads. And then songs like Safe Home and Superhero and Black Dahlia, Anywhere But Here. Like, there are some good songs on here, but it's just too much, too many tracks, and some of them are way too short when you feel like they could have expanded on some of these ideas. But still, in comparison to Stomp 442 and Volume 8, this is like a breath of fresh air for the band, if I'm going to be honest. So to call this album a step up is a bit of an understatement. But still, it's okay. Nothing amazing, nothing that will offend you, really. It's just kind of there. And that's why it's my number 9. Now, they finally get back to doing tours once again after the release of We've Come For You All, and then eventually 2004, and I believe they were doing some stuff with Damage Plan at that time, and also, of course, Dime still being close brothers with Anthrax doing stuff. And then more tragedy strikes Anthrax. December 8th, 2004, we lost Dimebag Darrell up in Columbus in a murder during a show at the Rosa Villa Club. And another case where it just affected everybody, and again, it affected Anthrax. Similar to what happened with Cliff, Dime was like a secret 6th member of Anthrax because he'd been doing stuff with them for the past 9 years. And super close with the guy. And it just kind of led again to more dark stuff happening with the band, as Frankie was kind of becoming a little bit frustrated, so the band decided to take a bit of a hiatus in 2004. However, at the same time of the hiatus, Frankie ended up joining Helmet for a little bit, but then comes back once the band regrouped in 2005. However, this regrouping was to lead to a reunion tour where you would have Joey Belladonna come back to do half of a show with Anthrax, and then John do half of a show, and then they do a song together. John wasn't into that idea, unfortunately, so he bowed out of the band. Joey comes back, and then Rob, he would be placed on hold to bring Dan Spitz back because they wanted to do a classic lineup reunion tour going from 2005 to 2007. Even though everybody felt like it was kind of forced upon them, it didn't quite feel natural, and they even felt the timing wasn't right to do this, and kind of led to some awkwardness. And some of the shows, not quite the best, but then 2007 comes around, the reunion tour ends, Rob Caggiano comes back, and then for the new vocalist, they would get Dan Nelson to come in, and he would be in the band until around mid-2009, and it's unclear as to what happened. Like, this is one of those big mysteries, like what happened to Dan Nelson, because it seemed like he was getting ready to record with the band, and had some stuff written, but he ended up gone in 2009. And I've heard conflicting reports, like he either got really sick, or he was fired for being an asshole, or got into some kind of accident. I don't know. It's such a big mystery. I don't know the real story of what happened to Dan Nelson. But Dan Nelson would be gone, and then the end of 2009, Anthrax had to go to Europe to do some festival shows, and they would bring back John Bush for a little bit, and he would come in to fill out the tour for the festival tour, and then bow out in, I believe, March or April of 2010, and then Joey Belladonna was properly welcomed back, and he's been in the band ever since. And it was also during this late spring, early summer time frame in 2010 We got the tour of tours, the Big Four tour over in Europe. Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, Anthrax. Hell, I have the live DVD when they played in Bulgaria, and it's still an iconic DVD and an iconic moment in music history. So, over the next couple of years, they would be doing these on and off Big Four shows, either here in the States or over in Europe or elsewhere. But they would actually finally get to go back to the studio in late 2010 and work on the stuff they had been working on since 2008, but it didn't finish up until 2011. And then finally, as far as record stuff, still with Nuclear Blast, but also back home to Megaforce, so they're on both labels. And then released in September of 2011, we get Worship Music. This is my number 4 album. Welcome back. Oh, welcome back, Anthrax. No longer are we toying around with alternative stuff and too much of the groove metal. We're getting back to what we were good at, and that's thrash. Even though there's still the groove metal on this album, it was done much better and used more effectively. There's much more thrash going on here, and of course, Joey Belladonna's vocals, they definitely do sound a lot different in the years since Persistence of Time. Like, his voice has aged well. Like, he kind of sounds closer now to Ronnie James Dio than anything else, which is really cool. And this album, top to bottom, filled with some killer songs. Earth on Hell, The Devil You Know, Fight Until You Can't, In the End. Even a song called Judas Priest, where they incorporated memorable verses and song titles from Judas Priest. Crawl, there's some killer songs on here. I would say in terms of what could be the most underrated comeback album, this would be in that running, because it had been 8 years since We've Come For You All, and this is also a comeback from a rough patch in the band's history. Definitely the best work they've done in 20 plus years. Holy shit, it's fantastic, and it is my number 4. So going forward, lots of touring, more of the Big Four shows going on and off for the next year. And then in 2013, Rob Caggiano would leave the band altogether to join Volbeat, and coming in for guitars is John Donay from Shadows Fall, which is an interesting choice, considering he's a much younger guy, but hell of a player. If you've listened to his playing on a Shadows Fall album, you know the guy can write riffs and shred his ass off. And he's still in the band to this day, and also still doing stuff in Shadows Fall, meaning he's a busy guy. So this is the lineup currently: Scott, Charlie, Frankie, Joey, and Jonathan. And they would get back to the studio sometime in late 2014 and pretty much work on the album throughout the majority of 2015. And then finally released in February of 2016, we would get For All Kings. I actually reviewed this album when it came out in 2016, back when I wasn't doing a very good job at reviewing albums. But if you want to watch some cringy shit, go and watch that review. But this is my number 5. I would say it's just as good as Worship Music, and I would say you could argue it kind of expands on what they were doing with Worship Music. I'd say there's more thrash on this album than on Worship Music. A lot less of the groove metal, and you also got some killer songs like the title track, Breathing Lightning, Evil Twin, Blood Eagle Wings, Zero Tolerance. I mean, if you want to know my full opinion about it, go watch my review from 7 years ago, and you'll understand. But yeah, For All Kings, my number 5. And that is currently, as of this recording, the latest Anthrax album. I know they're still in the studio working on their next album, which hopefully it'll come sooner rather than later, because it's been a long wait, and I look forward to hearing what they've been working on since this album, and it should be awesome. But yeah, that is, of course, my ranking of all things Anthrax. Yeah, this was a bit long, but then again, there was a lot of differing stories going on in this band's history. But it feels good to get through the Big Four, and of course, Anthrax. Yeah, they're definitely the odd man out, but they belong in the Big Four. Crucify me if you want. But yeah, that is overall the ranking for Anthrax. So, only got 3 more rankings coming for the rest of the year. Next ranking, we're going to get a little bit proggy and a little bit blackened. We're going to talk about Enslaved at some point in mid to late September. But until then, I hope you guys have a good one. Keep your horns high and your dreams wet.